back to that little bar. That little bar. They made all the iron on that little bar. And I rebuilt that lever. It was rod. They could $900 that lever.
Most of the Jubal early in the valley came around in '64, and one of them got captured. Maybe both of them got captured. I always try to imagine the Yankees when they got a good look at that dude. Boy, you ain't from around here, are you? Because they look like they were from China.
Check.
They look like they were from China. So, yeah.
Sort of. Not really. I got instrumentalists in China.
The guy started that thing 30 years ago.
Check, how about that?
Long
Check.
ago in a galaxy far, far away. And I have lost good sheep. I was trying to lose good sheep, but I've lost
Check. Check.
Yeah. Right up in Dallas.
Check. That's about 3/4 on the vocal and half on the drum. Check. Check. That's a little better.
Check.
They had one, had one of the boys at that church in Hammond, had a little Jeep. I remember.
I gave
A
you
little reenactment. Come out there, an old path track to break down.
They would come up there, things sweet and come up there.
Well, welcome everybody. I don't know if we can get everybody over here. Y'all want to come over too? They're going like, yeah? Okay. Well, listen, those of you that know me, I don't have to tell you my name, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I'm Greg Cheek. I'm in the Richmond Hill Law School Commission here. And we do open houses April through October, and this is our last one of the season, so good to see everybody out here. We call it Civil War Day. We just couldn't think of another name. With Civil War things as a theme, we try to focus on different things every year. And this year we're very pleased to have some real talented people with us here, including Tom. Tom and I like to pick at each other. Tom Perry is a local author. I don't know if you've been out to some of the antique malls or some of the bookstores, but you'll see Tom has books out there on Mayberry and Jeb Stuart, Patrick County. I can't remember all the titles, but Tom has a bunch of his books over here if you want to look through them, if you see anything of interest. But Tom and I have been friends for decades, yes. And Tom is also famous for something that a lot of you may not know.
Oh, God.
And he's going to like me for this. But has anybody ever been to the Jeb Stuart reenactment? I know several of us have. Back in 1988, Tom was part of that group and probably spearheaded the group and actually set that aside to borrow his property. And so he is a very important member of the community, loves history just like the rest of us, and his passion was to get the home place, Jeb Stuart's home place, sort of fixed up and available for public consumption. And so we've been doing that reenactment. He was telling me a while ago that reenactment got started as a sort of commemoration, and they thought it would be a one-time only thing. And look at it later, 30 years later, they're still doing the reenactment. But Tom is going to talk to us today about something near and dear to his heart, Jeb Stuart. But there's a North Carolina connection today, and I'm not going to try to steal your thunder, but I'm excited to hear this because I don't think I've ever heard this talk from Tom. So please join me, give Tom a welcome here, and we'll let him do some talking.
Thank you, Greg. You didn't abuse me near as bad as I thought you would. Chris Hartley could teach you a few things, boy. Good morning. How is everybody? Yeah. I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate Greg and Barbara and everybody with the Richmond Hill for inviting me. They must not have been able to find anybody else, is all I could figure. Chris Hartley must be at a Carolina football game or something, so I don't know. Michael Hardy ran off somewhere in Tennessee, I saw this weekend, so he's not here. But we do have his tree.
Well, he was here last year, and he's still going to that tree.
The tree. So I'm gonna talk about something a little different today. You know, you think about Jeb Stuart, you think about Virginia, but we're going to talk about Jeb Stuart in North Carolina, and hopefully I'll tell you a few things that you may or may not know about him. I know a bunch of you come to the birthplace, and I appreciate that. 32 encampments, and it's been 30 years since we started that. And Jeb Stuart's birthplace is on the National Register and the State Register. If you're interested, on November 4th, we're going to have a walking tour of the birthplace, something we haven't done before, where we're going to walk around and talk about all the different histories of the birthplace, which you may or may not know about. You know, it goes all the way back to the Revolution, where his great-grandfather got killed there by a pro-British Tory. And we're going to walk around and talk about all the different histories of the birthplace. And that's a fundraiser for the scholarship I started in my parents' name several years ago, and we give a Patrick County senior a scholarship every year. So we're doing that to raise money. So that's November 4th. I got some flyers about it. If you're interested, there's no
charge, you can come out there and I'll try to walk you to death. We do have a bear at the birthplace now, at least we did before the encampment, so all you have to do is outrun Greg. That's all you got to do.
That will be hard to do.
On August the 5th, 1854, just out of West Point, the United States Military Academy, Lieutenant James Ewell Brown Stuart was at a crossroads in his life. He'd been traveling around Piedmont, North Carolina, visiting family and friends, and as that evening progressed, he found himself at the foot of Pilot Mountain. And I noticed driving over here today, you really can see Pilot Mountain from everywhere. It really was a guide. You really can see it from everywhere. Well, a thunderstorm blew up, and Jeb Stuart was unable to sleep, and being the romantic young fella he was, it inspired him to poems. He wrote a poem that night under the base of Pilot Mountain, and I'll just read one stanza. I promise you, that's all I'll read. Jeb's poetry is an acquired taste. He wrote that night, "'Twas all a dream, and such are the dreams of youth. Alas, how many hearts have felt this truth? Such dreams have tantalized my soul and borne me off to my ambition's goal." His ambition had been born years ago. He was the great-grandson of a man who fought at Guilford Courthouse, Alexander Stuart, which was a connection to North Carolina. Alexander Stuart had been in the Virginia militia. He had been wounded and captured by the British, supposedly. And just to show you how things get going in your family history, supposedly he was so brave that Cornwallis himself gave his sword back to him. Now, I don't know if I believe that or not, but that was his story and he's sticking to it. Jeb Stuart was born February the 6th, 1833. He was one of 11 children to Archibald and Elizabeth Letcher Pannell Stuart, and it's through her that the family came to live there. He was born about the same time that John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson were fighting over nullification, if you know your history about all of this. It's almost like Jeb Stuart, I think, sometimes was born to be in this war. He literally was born while nullification was going on, which is when South Carolina first started talking about seceding from the Union. He spent his formative years there at the foot of Groundhog Mountain on a 1,500-acre farm that many of you have been to. Birthplace owns 75 of the 1,500 acres at Laurel Hill, which was the name of the farm. His great-grandfather, William Letcher, was buried there, killed during the Revolution, as I mentioned. And if Jeb Stuart came back to life today, I think the only thing he would notice, that he would recognize, is the grave of his great-grandfather. His great-grandfather died at the age of 30 during the American Revolution. Jeb Stuart is going to die at the age of 31. And I think the parallels between the two of them are pretty amazing. Stuart lived there for about 12 years. They sent him up to Withville to school because Patrick County didn't have a state champion baseball team yet, but we do now, by gosh. Yes, sir. He spent time in Wythe County and Pulaski County. 1848, he entered Emory and Henry College. They're the Fighting Wasps of Emory and Henry. I always think that's funny. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, I guess. And yes, there was a movement to change the name, but it didn't work. It didn't work. Jeb Stuart he's going to spend 2 years at Emory and Henry College, a Methodist school. He joins the Methodist Church when he's there. Jeb's mother was a very high church Episcopalian, which I take to mean she was almost Catholic in her viewpoint. I think his father was a bit of a backsliding Presbyterian, but I don't know much about Archibald's religion. But religion would be a very important part of Jeb Stuart's life. He'll later convert to Episcopal Church of his mother when he's in the U.S. Army. In 1850, he gets appointed to West Point, the United States Military Academy, and just to show you, he's 17 years old. If you want to see what he looked like, I have a picture of him over here on the cover of one of my books without the beard. And Jeb without the beard is an acquired taste too. I will tell you, his classmates thought that he was so ugly they called him Beauty Stewart. He said when he arrived at West Point that, I quote, "I rejoice to say that I still have evidence of a Savior's pardoning love. When I came here, I had reason to expect that many and strong temptations would beset my path, but I relied on Him whom to know is everlasting life to deliver me from temptation." That's pretty good for a 17-year-old who's 20 or 30 miles from New York City. Yankees. On his way to West Point, Jeb Stuart went to a place that we all know is Charlottesville, Virginia. Did I mention I went to Virginia Tech? Okay, so now you understand why I'm about to say this. Jeb Stuart stopped at the University of Virginia. He went up to Monticello. He chipped off a piece of Mr. Jefferson's gravestone, the vandal. He picked roses for Mr. Jefferson's garden, and he went down and visited many friends at the University of Virginia. He wrote a letter home about his travels to Charlottesville, and this is what he said. He said everything was great except for one thing. He says, the women of Charlottesville have got to be the ugliest of the ugly. I went to Virginia Tech. He went to Congress on his way to West Point, where he saw Jefferson Davis in the Senate chamber and was very impressed. Jeb Stuart's first couple years at West Point, he's in the top of his class, as high as 6th at one time. Some cadets suffered. Stonewall Jackson comes to mind, had a terrible time at West Point, almost flunked out. Jeb Stuart thought it was glorious. He loved it. He did very well. His friends at West Point included Robert E. Lee's son Custis, who was in the same class. In the last 2 years he was there, Robert E. Lee himself was the superintendent at West Point. So Jeb Stuart's connection to Robert E. Lee began there. He visited the Lee house, became very friendly with all the Lee children. If you know anything, you know that Robert E. Lee's daughters never married, none of them. But that's not from a lack of effort from Cadet Stuart, I promise you that. He would still be corresponding with Mary Lee, the daughter, right up until his death. They remained very good friends. Another friend he made at West Point might surprise you. Is Oliver Otis Howard. If you know anything about the Army of the Potomac, Oliver Otis Howard commanded the 11th Corps in the Union Army. He's the poor fella who Stonewall Jackson flanked at Chancellorsville, and at Gettysburg, he's the poor guy, I think, that Jubal Early flanks. Oliver Otis Howard had a knack for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. I like to call him uh-oh instead of oh-oh Howard. But he was very friendly with Jeb Stuart. Now, Howard is from Maine. He's an abolitionist. The other Southern cadets did something they called the freeze out. They wouldn't talk to him. They absolutely would not talk to Oliver Otis Howard because he was a Northern abolitionist and was very vocal, except for one. Howard wrote, "I can never forget the manliness of J.E.B. Stuart. We studied the Bible together every week." So Stuart, again, I'm making the point to you here that we have this image of Jeb Stuart as being a little frivolous, the man who's always riding around with his banjo player, but he is a very, very devout Christian man. So much so that when the other cadets would not talk to this Union man, Jeb Stuart did, because they have the thing in common that they did Bible study together every week. Stuart wrote one time about wanting to buy his parents' home in Patrick County. He said, "I might have rambled the dear old hills of Patrick amid all the pleasures of a mountain home for a lifetime." If you've been to the birthplace, it's up there on that little statue of Jeb now that they had his great-great-great-grandson model for, and they put up a little marker there. What Jeb Stuart would do, though, is he would ramble the Piedmont of North Carolina in 1852 and in 1854 when he was home from West Point. He visited places such as Sourtown, which was a plantation owned by the Harstons, not the Harstons, the Harstons, where he was noted that he looked so much like his sister Columbia, they recognized him immediately. Columbia is right down the road here. She's married to Peter Harston, who owned Coolmey Plantation over here in Davie County. We think that Jeb Stuart may have actually helped build that house. He certainly helped his brother-in-law with plans for that house, bringing architecture books from West Point with him. He said of his sister when he visited her at Coolmey that I kept her laughing as long as I stayed, making myself ridiculous in various ways. I guess he was building a esprit de corps in his sister when he visited her at Coolmey. Stuart was very good, I think, at putting on a mask to get what he wanted done. He will have the, you know, the plumed hat and the banjo player, and I think a lot of this stuff is to build a spree in his men, to keep them motivated, to keep their spirits up, and he does the same with his sister. During his travels, Stuart is going to dine with a hypochondriac Episcopal minister he describes, who was quite sure he had cholera. He did not. He visited his other sister, Victoria, at Salem Female Academy. He visited Panther Creek over here in Forsyth County, which was the Williams home, God's Hill, which I think is still there. He was Joseph Williams was a member of the Council of State and a trustee at Chapel Hill. Stuart visited Congressman Augustine Shepard, who lived where Bargrave and Walltown Streets in Winston-Salem are. If you've ever been there lately, it's not quite what it was, I promise you. As I said, he's going to return to West Point. He's going to graduate in 1854, 13th out of a class of 46. The family tradition was always that he wanted to be a cavalryman. If you graduated too high at West Point, you became an engineer. He didn't want to be an engineer, and I think he let his grades slip on purpose so he could be a cavalryman. He, as I mentioned, would visit with the Lees during those last 2 years. Mrs. Lee, Mary Lee, the daughter Mary and the mother Mary. Mary Lee became very fond of Jeb Stuart. In fact, thought of him almost as a surrogate son. He came home to Mount Airy in 1854 after graduating. He said, I attended the post office regularly at Mount Airy. He went over to Martinsville and Henry County, where he visited his cousin Betty Harston, who lived at Beaver Creek, which is still there. I think it's the headquarters of Carter Bank and Trust now. They own it. The family tradition was that he proposed to Betty, and she turned him down. I think it's more aptly that her daddy turned him down, Marshall Harston. Betty would end up marrying her cousin Watt, J.T.W. Watt. They literally kept the money in the family. They married each other. That's what they did. Jeb Stuart was to come back today, I don't think he'd recognize all the Mayberry souvenir shops in Mount Airy, but he would have rode right down that same street. Mount Airy was a place that was getting ready to bust through with tobacco and textiles. He passed by the Methodist church where his mother and his siblings all went up on what we call Lebanon Hill. 2 of Jeb Stuart's sisters had been confirmed by Bishop Ives in 1852. He rode by the home of Robert Galloway and Dr. Joseph Hollingsworth, who was also the doctor to the Siamese twins, and was Jeb Stuart's mother's doctor. Stuart would come down into Main Street there and pick up his mail at the Blue Ridge Hotel, which is at the corner of Oak and Main Street, right beside the Mount Airy History Museum. If you're ever over there, Mount Airy has a great history museum. I tell you this because I live with the curator of the Mount Airy History Museum, and I am afraid not to say that. Because Jeb Stuart had grown up near Mount Airy, over the years I've had all kinds of people tell me stories about him. None of them I can document, but I have little ladies walk up to me and tell me things such as that their grandmother used to dance with Jeb Stuart at the Blue Ridge Hotel, and that one time she was so taken with him that she, quote, fell down in a swoon. Whatever, I guess they had a fainting bout. Greg's thinking about fainting right about now because he invited me to talk. As I said, Stuart picked up the mail. They went to church in Mount Airy. The town of Stuart today is, of course, about 25 miles away from where he was born, whereas Mount Airy was 5 miles away. So they, like all the people I grew up with in Ararat, Virginia, not North Carolina, we all went to Mount Airy because that was the closest town. I don't know that Jeb Stuart ever encountered the Siamese twins, but I would like to think that that happened at least once. Gosh, what I wouldn't have given to hear that conversation. He's going to be sent out west, first to Texas, and then Jefferson Davis is going to appoint him to the 1st United States Cavalry. Jefferson Davis was the Secretary of War for the United States. A lot of you might not know that. He is actually considered to be one of the best Secretaries of War the United States ever had. He had the disappointing time to be the Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce, probably one of the worst presidents we ever had. But Davis was very good as Secretary of War. He appointed Stuart to the 1st United States Cavalry, along with a lot of other guys who will be in the war, including Robert E. Lee. Stuart's going to get married while he's out west. He marries Flora Cook, who is the daughter of Philip St. George Cook, who was another United States Cavalry officer. In fact, he wrote the cavalry manual for the United States Army. Stuart, as I said, converted to his mother's Episcopal faith, but as all things, Jeb Stuart didn't do it halfway. He started founding churches. He's founded a church still there in Junction City, Kansas. He sent his mother $100 back in Ararat and asked her to match it because he wanted to put a log church up in Ararat because, quote, he never saw a place that needed one so bad. When Mrs. Stuart sold the property, she set aside an acre of land for that church. I don't know that it ever got built, but every church in Ararat now claims it's that church, but I don't know that that ever happened. As I said, Jeb married Flora Cook. He said of her, "I came, I saw, I was conquered." They'll have at least 3 children who survive to adulthood, or at least 2 of them have their own children. He does many things when the United States Cavalry. He's going to be a quartermaster. Here's an example of what Jeb Stuart did one day in the United States Cavalry. He left one day to get horses. He rode 34 miles in 10 hours from Fort Riley to Fort Leavenworth, where he arrived and left with 9 wagons, arriving back at Fort Riley. He learned to develop skills to command large numbers of men and to supply them. He was initiative. He was considered a fine officer. He's going to raise to the rank of captain before he resigned. He, of course, in 1859 is sitting in the War Department office when the telegraph goes crazy because somebody has taken the arsenal or tried to take the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He will accompany Robert E. Lee there, and they will capture John Brown. Stuart's the only person, I think, there who recognized John Brown because he had seen him in Kansas, where John Brown had become quite a nuisance for himself. Stuart is the one that Lee sends to the door of the firehouse, and the door opens and a giant gun is stuck in Stuart's face, and behind it is a giant John Brown who's telling everybody his name is Smith, but Stuart immediately recognized who he was. That same year of 1859, Jeb Stuart comes back to North Carolina. He comes with President James Buchanan, who goes to the University of North Carolina for the commencement exercise. I guess he was the speaker that year. And our good friend Chris Hartley says this is the thing that made Jeb Stuart, that he went to Chapel Hill one time to hear the president talk. I would point out to you that Jeb Stuart described President Buchanan as gay and happy that day. If you don't know, James Buchanan is probably considered to be the only gay president we ever had, literally a gay president. Hartley loves to point that out to me that Jeb went to Chapel Hill with Buchanan. I will tell you, Jeb Stuart's papers, a lot of them are at Chapel Hill because Peter Harston down in Cooley gave them to Chapel Hill, so it's a great library to visit if you want to learn about Jeb Stuart. He's going to resign in May of 1861. He waits to see what Virginia's going to do, and when Virginia leaves the Union, so does he. He's going to first go to the Shenandoah Valley, where he'll be under the command of, believe it or not, Thomas J. Jackson. He's not stonewalled quite yet. Eventually he'll come under Joseph Johnston in the valley in 61. Stuart is going to be at the Battle of First Manassas, where he's going to charge into a group of very daintily dressed New York Zouaves and send them packing for Washington, D.C. Jubal Early, who was a cousin of Jeb Stuart, said of him that day that he believed that Jeb Stuart and 250 yelling men on black horses won the battle. Jeb Stuart gets promoted to Brigadier General. Jeb had 2 brothers. One was John Dabney Stuart. He served in the 54th Virginia Infantry, which is in the Army of Tennessee. He was a doctor. And Jeb's other brother is William Alexander Stuart, who I have a giant big book about over here written by his great-grandson. He ran the salt works in Saltville. If you've ever been to Saltville, Virginia, Jeb's brother ran those. His house was recently bought by a lady that does one of these television programs about restoring houses, so I hope she's going to do something to that. It's a beautiful old home. I will tell you that William Alexander Stuart is kind of the hero of this story in a lot of ways because he survives. And after the war, he's going to take care of Jeb's widow, Flora. She's going to come to Saltville and live for quite a while. Jeb's mother is going to come and live with her son, William. two of Jeb Stuart and William's sisters come to Saltville, and William literally saves his family because he takes care of everybody, and they all lived in that big house that I was just telling you about. June of '62, Jeb Stuart's going to ride around McClellan when Robert E. Lee takes command of the Union of the Army of Northern Virginia. Of course, the 7 days will happen after that. Jeb Stuart will be promoted to Major General in the Army of Northern Virginia. At Antietam or Sharpsburg, it's Jeb Stuart who finds that Little Mac found Robert E. Lee's lost orders, and thereby Robert E. Lee knows that McClellan knows what Robert E. Lee knows, and McClellan still doesn't do anything. He's still got the slows. Stuart again will ride around McClellan's army. He does it 3 times in 1862, and the 3rd time he's going to get George B. McClellan fired because Abraham Lincoln has had quite enough of this. May of '63, Stuart is going to take command when Jackson is wounded. Jeb Stuart will lead the infantry of the 2nd Corps to what is Robert E. Lee's greatest victory. Stonewall reportedly told Stuart to do what he thinks best, that I have implicit confidence in him. During Chancellorsville, Jeb Stuart is up against the legend of North Carolina historical markers, George Stoneman. Stoneman is sent off from Chancellorsville toward Richmond, and he's not present at the battle. And that, of course, makes George Stoneman the perfect scapegoat, and they pretty much fire him, and he'll end up out west. Poor old George. Our good friend Chris Hartley has written a whole book about Stoneman's '65 raid. George, there's just so much to pick on George about. I don't know if we have enough time today. George Stoneman had the worst disease possible for a cavalryman. He had hemorrhoids. He will die of hemorrhoids, believe it or not, after the war. But imagine a cavalryman with hemorrhoids. Jeb Stuart is going to fight the biggest cavalry battle of the whole war at Brandy Station on June the 9th, 1863. He's going to, of course, then be absent for the first day and a half at Gettysburg, so whole forests of trees can be cut down to write books about it. Jeb Stuart is often faulted for his absence at Gettysburg. You all know the famous scene, if you watched Gettysburg, where Robert E. Lee supposedly dresses Jeb Stuart down, or as Martin Sheen and Joseph Fuqua in the movie. In the movie, if that movie got one thing right, they got the way Robert E. Lee did it. There's not one first-hand account of Robert E. Lee dressing down Jeb Stuart at Gettysburg, where anybody saw it or heard it. What Robert E. Lee did to you was he took you into the office and he sat down and he talked with you. He didn't make a public spectacle of embarrassing you. He did this with A.P. Hill. He did this with Stuart, I think, where he says to you, let's not think of this anymore and help me beat these people. And that would have been what Robert E. Lee did. In the movie, that's how they depict it. But you hear of scenes where it's always Jeb Stuart's fault and Robert E. Lee dresses him down. It never happened in public. It never once happened in public. Robert E. Lee was very good with psychology, and he knew how to handle men. He was one of the greatest managers of men I ever saw. Heck, he could even handle Jefferson Davis, and nobody could handle Jefferson Davis. Ask Joe Johnson and John Bell Hood and any myriad of other men. Stonewall Jackson didn't even get along with Jefferson Davis, but Robert E. Lee did. Robert E. Lee did. So we'll talk a minute just about Jeb Stuart's Tar Heels. The 1st North Carolina first came to Stuart in October of 1861. They were commanded by men such as Robert Ransom and Rufus Beringer and Lawrence Baker, and of course our friend Hartley's friend James B. Gordon of Wilkesboro. Gordon is going to be wounded the same time Stuart is during the Battle of Yellow Tavern and will die about a week later. They first served in Wade Hampton's brigade and then the North Carolina Brigade, and they played a pivotal role for Jeb Stuart as this war went on. The 2nd North Carolina Cavalry was first with Stuart in November 1862. They went on the Christmas raid, the Dumfries raid of that year, and they chased after our good friend George Stoneman during Chancellorsville. The 3rd North Carolina Cavalry served from Stuart from April '64 till his death. They almost didn't get there with Jeb.
they, of course, 1863. They were at the first Grand Review at Brandy Station and rode with Stuart throughout the rest of his life. 5th North Carolina also was at Brandy Station. They were under the command of Beverly Robertson, just like the 4th. Stuart didn't much like Beverly Robertson, and just, I don't know if this is the reason, but Beverly Robertson had been one of the young men who was pursuing Flora Cook back in the old Army in Kansas. Stuart didn't get along with Grumble Jones, another one of his subordinate officers. Of course, with a man named Grumble, I don't know who did get along with him, but Stuart tended to favor the Virginians. But I think it would be a mistake for you to think that it was just the Virginians he favored. He became to think of James B. Gordon and the North Carolina Brigade as his shock troops. When he really needed a hard, tough job, he would send these North Carolina regiments to do it. And he came to rely on James B. Gordon especially. In the summer of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant is going to come east and take command of the Army of the Potomac. He's going to send Phil Sheridan to do, quote, inflict a blow from which the entire recovery was impossible. John Sedgwick gets killed right about this time. He'd been one of Stuart's commanding officers in the old U.S. Army. And he said, I love this, he said, Jeb Stuart was one of the greatest cavalrymen ever foaled in North America. On May the 11th, 1864, Jeb Stuart was shot by one of George Custer's Michiganders. Yellow Tavern is a place just north of Richmond. It's today housing development. It's been totally developed. It's almost all gone. But there is a marker to Jeb Stuart that's there, and it's put up by the men who served under him. He got killed or shot by one of Custer's men who we argue over who did this. For years, a fellow named John Huff was given credit for shooting Jeb Stuart because George Custer said that it was John Huff. But I mean, honestly, folks, are we going to believe anything George Custer says? Come on. They take Jeb Stuart into town and put him at his brother-in-law's home, which was on Gray Street. Today, it is the parking lot for the Richmond City Police Department. The house is long gone, but in the parking lot, there's a granite marker in the side of the wall there, and it says, "Here died J.E.B. Stuart. He gave his life to save the women of Richmond." Back up at Spotsylvania Courthouse, Robert E. Lee was taken to tears. He said, "I can scarcely think of him without weeping." Phil Sheridan said of Jeb Stuart, "Since the beginning of the war, this general had distinguished himself by the management of the Confederate mounted force under his command. It had been nurtured under Lee's army and acquired such prestige that it thought itself well nigh invincible. Indeed, in the early years of the war, it was." So while Virginia has lots of reasons to be proud of Jeb Stuart, North Carolina does too. In one of the last letters he ever wrote to his wife, Flora, Jeb Stuart says, "If anyone speaks to you of subjugation, tell them it shows a total ignorance of what constitutes our armies. Long after the inhabitants crouch to the conqueror, our armies will tread with the triumph of victories, free men over the dead bodies of the vainglorious foe. North Carolina has done nobly in this army, and never allow her troops to be abused in your presence." Another North Carolinian, Charles Stedman, for years and years, he was a congressman in the United States Congress. On February the 6th every year, Stedman would rise to speak. He was the last veteran of the war in the United States Congress, and he would obtain unanimous consent, and for 5 minutes on February the 6th every year, he would talk about Jeb Stuart. And I thank you very much for having me here today. If anybody's got any questions, Greg will be happy to answer.
I think I learned something today. Did anybody learn anything today? Yeah! That was really good. You went everywhere with Jeb Stuart.
Yeah, I've been everywhere with Jeb Stuart. My mother used to joke about it. She said I'd been everywhere that Jeb Stuart's horse had ever put down. And 30 years ago, when we had the first encampment out there, my mother, who was as good a Christian woman and Baptist WMU member
just totally out of character. Looks out there, she was from Georgia. Did I mention she was from Georgia? She looks out there and sees all these blue uniforms laying dead on the ground. And she looked at me and said, "Don't that do your heart good?" Anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments? We can talk about Andy Griffith if y'all want to. I wrote a book about him too. Andy was named for his great uncle or great uncle who fought in the 26th North Carolina. His mother named her only son after her father and her uncle. And I tell you that, but don't tell anybody because somebody will try to take Andy and Opie's statue down. But anyway, thank y'all very much. I'll be over here if you have any questions.
And I'll add that Tom is going to do this same program again at 1:15, and then at 12:15, Danny and Eva Stevens back here are going to play the game. So we'll hang around for that. This is going to be a real treat as well.
Thank y'all.
Thank you so much.
How are y'all fellas? I know you.
Yeah, we took some travels together.